My name is Amy Seiffert, and this is Three Words Podcast, a bite-sized podcast about powerful choices and perspective shifts that just might change your life. And today I am so excited to talk to my friend, Martha. She is an educator, a writer, a bridge builder. You're going to love her. And we talk about how every story matters. And I think you're just going to really enjoy this episode. Martha, I am so glad to be talking with you today. How are you?
Yeah, I am so excited to be speaking with you today, Amy.
Okay, our three words I'm so excited about. Can you give them to us today?
The 3 words today is your story matters.
Okay, let's talk all about this. Like, why does this resonate with you? Give us some of your thoughts on this.
Well, the whole idea of story and storytelling, I think is very, very meaningful to me, because as a kid, I just loved, I loved just disappearing into stories. I was an introvert. It was a big part of my life.
Yeah.
And I think storytelling is just really important because it's kind of like a time machine. It connects us to our past. It connects us to our ancestors. And it transcends time and space. It's the one thing that we can do in which we can travel not just back in time, but we can travel to places and meet people that we may never meet in our ordinary lives.
Yes.
And storytelling allows us to kind of bridge all these, divides and have these, meaningful experiences in which you step inside someone else's shoes and, see the world through their lens. Storytelling, I think, is also really important because it's a way for us to preserve, our familial history.
Yes.
I think especially in Black and Brown cultures, the oral tradition is a very important part of our culture. It's a way that we transmit, our history down generations. Is a way that our ancestors impart their wisdom. And how I learned about my culture, especially living outside of it, is when I'd visit, India and South India and sit at my grandmother's feet, called her Achi.
I love this.
I would sit at Achi's feet and she would tell me all these stories about my, grandparents, great-grandparents. And, and so I was able to learn about my ancestors and I was able to learn about people that I had never had the opportunity to meet through this, so it's a really, really important and meaningful thing to have. We see how the erasure of stories is so devastating and harmful. For example, we can think about, how the Indigenous Americans or Indigenous communities globally have had that erasure of their stories through the removal, of their bodies and their histories and their cultures. And and also the descendants of the enslaved and how their stories have also been stripped away. Yeah. And we've seen the devastating effects of that, how that has resulted in generational trauma, generational grief.
Yes.
And so this is why storytelling and stories matter.
Can I pause really quick to say, I hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you want to support it, you can subscribe, or share with a friend. Now, back to the show. Yes. Which... You said so many great things just there. So I love that picture of you sitting at your grandma's feet and connecting to your history in that way. I have, I'm thinking about around the table at various holidays and similar, everybody tell us about our backgrounds and our people. But this idea that not only do stories in general matter, the art of storytelling and how much we need that to connect us to one another, but also like your specific story mattering and my specific story mattering. But I think some of us are tempted to think that our own story doesn't matter. Can you share some thoughts on that idea?
Yeah, that's just a really good question. Thank you.
No,
everyone's stories matter because every single person in this world matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think, sometimes when we think about story, you think about, does that mean that we all need to publish a memoir? Most people don't want to do that. And we have to think about it in a more, deeper way. Storytelling as a way to share ourselves with other people.
Yes.
To share ourselves with our own, to kind of introspect. And so I think storytelling, even if it's, writing your story down in a journal privately, where you share your intimate thoughts on the paper, and nobody else sees it, that's one way. And or if you're sharing your story with people that you trust, with your counselor, your story matters, because even the process of expressing your story is important, because sometimes it can be cathartic, it can be therapeutic.
Yes.
It's a way of just validating and affirming who you are as a person in this world.
Yeah.
And I think this is particularly the case for those stories that are often like invisibilized or marginalized.
Yes. Tell me more.
Growing up, I loved reading books. I loved movies. My parents watched a lot of movies. They're Indian.
Yes.
And, Indians love their movies.
Love it.
We're the largest movie watching audience in the world, I think. I mean, there's a lot of us. But
I love it,
we do watch a lot of movies. And so I watched a lot of movies at a very young age, read a lot of books. And I just would get engrossed in the plots and really relate to the characters. And but none of the characters looked like me.
Yeah.
I didn't see myself represented in any of these art forms, in any of these literary forms.
Yeah.
And there is this kind of longing and this ache when you don't see yourself reflected in the things that you love.
100%.
That bring you joy and beauty, And
because you want to see yourself in the story, right?
And then also seeing yourself in the story affirms who you are.
Yes.
Affirms your dignity and your worth and your value.
I love that.
And lets you know that there's somebody else like you.
Yeah.
And that
you're seen.
That you're seen, and that you're acknowledged and you're validated, and that your story matters, So I think it's really important to see that. And I loved Toni Morrison's quote, about this. She said, if there's a story that you want to read or a book that you want to read that hasn't been written, and I'm like paraphrasing here a little bit, but you get the gist. If there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it.
Let's go.
And of course she's talking about it literally, but we can take that figuratively as well. And we can write those stories, whether it's actually writing a book. And we do that not just for ourselves, but we do it for the others that look like us and want to see iterations of themselves in, in literature and art and whatever it is, however we express ourselves creatively.
Totally.
And I think representation matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It matters in every aspect and facet of our lives. And I think especially for the little Black and brown children, for me, I loved a lot of the stories and books that I read were written by white men.
Yeah.
And I love a lot of those books. But there was just there was a disconnect for sure.
Yeah.
And so when I finally started reading books by Black and brown women, I just came alive.
I was going to say, how did that make you feel when you started?
I felt validated and affirmed and empowered even.
Yeah.
Empowered not to just be like, oh, I deserve to be here. I deserve to take up space. But empowered to be like, maybe I can do this too.
Yes. If you can see it, you can be it. Joe Saxton always says.
Yes. And
right?
She's incredible too.
Yeah, but that matters, because if you haven't seen yourself in the story, in the narrative, that invisibility, right? You're wondering, am I allowed to take up space? I love that you just said that I can take up space here. And it matters. Yeah.
You want to make what's invisible visible.
Yes. I love that. So was that a journey for you when you started to see your different brown and Black women and that validated you? Were there parts of yourself that came alive that hadn't before? Like, how was that journey for you?
I definitely started to write more.
Yes.
And I definitely started to look for more books like that and expand my literary canon, because initially I was like, I want my fantasies to have this awesome library, that has every book in the canon. Yeah. And I realized even that was a form of being colonized. I was like, you know what? I don't need to read every book by Charles Dickens or whatever. Like I've read some of his books, but I can start reading books that are not read, books that are not even published by major publishers.
Right.
And there's marginalized authors, out there that there's this person on Instagram that I follow, and she's always about visibilizing those authors. And I think that's so incredible. Sometimes you have to kind of go outside of the mainstream in order to do that.
Yeah, I think that's sweet because we've talked about this before, but that idea of we want broader stories, not just that one single story.
Oh my gosh, yes. Now you're going to get me going on this
Let's
idea.
go. Yeah.
But yes, connected to that is the danger of the single story.
Yes.
And Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in her famous TED Talk says, that she talks about the danger of the single story. Because when we only value or hear one story or a certain story, even few stories, it is dangerous. It's fatal to the human, well-being, because when you only hear the story from one perspective, then you're missing out on the richness of all the perspectives, and you're also like invalidating those experiences, and you're perpetuating a form of like silencing and oppression.
I was thinking because you keep pushing everything out to the margins and keep centering this one kind of story. Yeah,
pushing it to the margins and maybe even removing and erasing and invisibilizing altogether. Yep. This erasure is so dangerous, and we see this erasure. For example, if you want to think about an example of how this erasure plays out and manifests, is in our history books, in the Western history books, where we see history, the story of humanity being told by the oppressor, being told by white patriarchal imperial beings. It's framed in the gaze of white patriarchal imperialism. And this is a story of empire. Winston Churchill, I think, said, history is written by the conquerors, it's written by the winners.
The victorious, right?
Victorious. Yes. And so, and there's so much truth to that and so much tragedy in that, because then when you are framing the story from your perspective, you get to say what you want to say. You get to sanitize history. You get to cleanse it from all its, heinousness. And then it ends up being this glamorization, this romanticization of, history, in which you see slavery is like, presented in this way, in that we don't see the fullness of the horror that it was, the project that it was. And similarly, what happened with the Indigenous Americans, we don't get to experience what that history really was from the lens of the crushed and oppressed. We see the romanticized version, of those things, so that we can continue to perpetuate those injustices that cause those events in history to happen in the first place. So this is why it's really important to have multiple stories, not just one story, two story, three stories, multiple stories from various places. Let's hear from Indigenous Americans, and not just Indigenous Americans broadly. There's like hundreds of nations. Let's hear from the Cherokee, the Muskoka, and all the and let's hear from different Black American, historians and different immigrants, and there are history books that do combine, they're out there on Amazon. We can find them.
Okay, I was going to say.
We can read them and we can have our kids read them that incorporate the retelling of history from various perspectives. And it's not factual. I mean, we all see things differently, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's why we get a more holistic, version of history when we allow for many different voices to come. And when we do that, why is that important? Because past is prologue. We're able to figure out, okay, when we did this and we allowed this genocide to happen, not on our watch. We don't want to do this again. So when we did this, this happened. So how can we make sure that that doesn't happen again? And we do that by looking at history as a whole. And so it allows us to look at our past. It allows us to make progress, but it also allows us to have empathy, not just for ourselves and for each other, but for the others, for the outliers in society. And I think that's why your story matters, my story matters, all of our stories collectively matter.
I love this. And this is something that I've appreciated about our friendship is you have given me a wider view of the world and have blown my mind on so many things. There might be a listener here today that's like, whoa, but I love it because we're talking about stories and what they do in this mega, like big thoughts and the narrative of how the world works. Like, it's just helpful to see the same event can be experienced, but radically different perspectives, right?
For sure.
And so to be able to like look all the way around an event and say, hold on, so much happened here.
Yeah.
Not just this one sliver of a vantage point, this POV here.
Speaking of that, so your story matters specifically. Amy's story matters specifically. Martha's story matters specifically because every single one of us in this world has a completely different fingerprint. We talked about this before.
I love it.
It's like we can live in the same household, but that's the one thing that separates us from every single human being in this earth is our fingerprints.
Yes.
Even identical twins
have different
fingerprints and they share the exact same DNA.
It's amazing.
And so we are so unique and particular and specific in who we are.
Yes.
And so that is why even within the same household, even within the same womb, the stories are different.
Yes. It's profound and it's beautiful. And it just hammers home the idea of how much we need everyone's story. And I think about someone listening today that may have feels unseen and marginalized, and wonders if her story matters. And it does.
It does.
We need it. It brings connection. It brings empathy, which you're so good at. And the empathy, man, that can change the world, right? When we hear
completely,
stories
entirely,
and step into those shoes, that's been huge for me. Oh my gosh, I have loved this conversation. We could go on for hours, but I am grateful for your perspective. I'm grateful for your thoughts. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Amy.
Absolutely.
For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.